So the topic of the talk is Windows Subsystem for Linux. I will be diving deeper into the newer Windows Subsystem for Linux 2 version. We will touch on the version 1 when it's appropriate, but the majority of the content is geared towards version 2. So we'll touch on version 1 a little bit in the past and in the introduction, just so that you've got an idea about what the differences are between the two. But moving forward into the present and future, the majority is based around the version 2. So we'll get started. So just a little bit about me. As I've mentioned already, I've just started a new group. We've got the first meeting a week and a half away. You can find us on Meetup if anyone's interested in attending that. It's we've got Lee Engelston, who's a Microsoft MVP. He's done a few different meetups now where he's presented about augmented reality using iOS and Xamarin, I think, and C#, and he's going to be presenting there. And like I say, you can find us on Meetup, like many of you have found this .NET Cambridge one. I'm a senior developer at Bet365, who are based in Stoke and Manchester, and I've got a website with a few blog posts. Again, I'm trying to get more active in the community, so that's slowly being built up with a few interesting blog posts if anyone wants to take a look. And the same with Twitter. I'm slowly getting more and more out there on Twitter, although I'm finding it hard to build a following. So I tweet stuff out, but it doesn't get very reshared or retweeted or anything. So feel free for follow on there as well. Like I say, I'm going to try and start putting more content out there. So, right, that's the boring stuff about me. So get on to the introduction. Yeah. So I don't know what base everyone's got, but cover off what Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, actually is, and cover off the fundamentals before we move forward. So it's functionality developed by Microsoft. Microsoft put this together to help developers to create and test products that are built for cross-platform. Just move that. Put some notes. There are two versions. So there's WSL1, which was launched in August 2016, I believe, and WSL2, which is newer from the last couple of years. We'll go more into the history of them moving forward, but or essentially both of these, what they do is they allow the user to run Linux binaries or Windows. What I will try and do moving forward throughout this presentation is when I'm referring to the general concept, which I don't think I do too often, I will just refer to as WSL. If I'm referring to one of the specific versions, so if I'm referring to just one, I will state WSL1 and or WSL2, because the underlying architectures for these two are quite different. So even though they're trying to achieve the same goal, one does it slightly better than the other one, but even that can be debated, so we'll cover that. So what problems does this solve? So this allows Windows users to as their main environment to be able to test and develop applications that will run on Linux. If you want to use Vim to edit your files while you're on a Windows machine, or use grep, then with WSL that is possible. So and that can also be flipped on its head. So if you want to edit files that run on Linux and you want to use Notepad++ or any other text editor that you favor on Windows, that also is possible. So applications that you are developing for Linux and Windows can now be tested directly from Windows. So there's no virtual machine, there's no hopping between the different devices. If you've got a KVM or anything like that, there's no need for that anymore. It's especially useful if you are running a language that's better supported, like Python, better supported from the Linux community, or Linux container, Docker containers running on Linux rather than Windows. All that becomes possible just from your single installation of Windows 10. So and it does give a virtually seamless set of functionality using quite a low amount of CPU, memory and storage as well, especially compared with a full virtual machine. There's a lot less resource usage from this WSL. So as we'll talk about further through the file systems, once you've got WSL installed and you've got it up and running, they're shared between the two different instances. So if you want to access your Linux files from Windows, like I've talked about, using the tooling, you can do that, and vice versa. So and as I'll show you as we get further through the integration between the two and the flipping between the two, it is very, very simple. Microsoft have done a great job when it comes to that. So a bit of background now on WSL1. So yeah, we'll dive into the deeper details further into the presentation. But so WSL1 essentially was a compatibility layer, so that Linux binaries could be executed on a Windows machine. The Linux syscalls were made on the Windows kernel after passing through passing through WSL. So it took these syscalls and translated them essentially into something that the Windows kernel could understand. For me, it's not quite exactly the same, but it's very similar to what Cygwin was trying to achieve. They are very WSL1 and Cygwin are very similar when you look at them, and both of them we're trying to achieve the running of Linux commands from Windows without having the virtual machine and the overhead of what a virtual machine gives you. So here's a visual representation of that from a very high level perspective. So as you can see, whether you made the calls from Windows binaries or Linux, it all took place on the Windows kernel ultimately. It's just that the Linux ones, like I said, pass through this transition layer. What this meant in that we're using this approach is that any larger operations, anything that had to pass through this layer multiple times, caused the performance to be significantly reduced as to what you would experience on Linux directly, and part of that was the cause for Microsoft to change tact and to come up with WSL2 really. So WSL2 uses a fully functioning Linux kernel. This is also where they're going to Microsoft will be focusing the majority of the efforts. I don't believe that WSL1 will be going anywhere anytime soon, because there are advantages to using that over WSL2, which we'll touch on in a bit. But the features that seem to be coming through thick and fast for WSL or for WSL2. So this uses Hyper-V or hypervisor for virtualization, and it is it achieves what WSL1 was trying to achieve by having the kernel essentially. WSL1, they were struggling to some calls they were struggling to translate due to the differences in the two kernels. Like Windows uses shorter file paths than Linux can possibly handle and stuff like that. So they were starting to hit bigger problems like that there was just absolutely no way that they could fix really. So I'll touch on the distros in a bit. Like I say, it is more performant, and the compatibility is a lot better because you are operating on a Linux kernel essentially, even if it is developed and maintained by Microsoft predominantly. It is open source, but so another advantage that this offers is that any new features are now available as soon as they're released to the kernel. You don't have to wait for and that kernel version's available on your machine, then you can get cracking with them. Previously with WSL1, if there was an update to the Windows kernel to support anything or whatever, then you would have to wait for some Microsoft employee to go and implement in the translation layer the change so that they could translate the calls between the OSs. So, and again, this is a very similar to the one before, except now you've got the virtualization at the bottom, and you've got the calls passing through into the kernels from the respective binaries. So your performance should be a lot better. As I've said, the virtualization that's used in this on this side is a VM. Microsoft refer to it as a lightweight utility VM that starts with a very small memory footprint, and it grows as and when you need it. But it uses much less memory than WSL1 does. So, like I've said in that previous slide, that it's more performant in some cases, and as I've stated in here, you will be better off using WSL2, and the only way that you are not is that if you've got files, the file access for WSL2 going from Linux to Windows is slower. So if you are using any files in any applications or anything that you are running using WSL2, you're better mounting them on the Linux or hosting them on the Linux side. So there are differences between having WSL1 and WSL2, and that so there might be a scenario where you can't host the files on Linux side, but you will pay a cost in terms of performance if not. So Windows Terminal, it's not quite directly related to WSL, but I just thought I would touch on this because it is a feature that come out around a similar time, and it does allow for a lot easier access when in terms of using WSL, especially if you're using it from a command line. So I don't know if anyone, I'm just going to cover it with a quick demo, but everyone might be aware of this new tool. So I'll just bring this over So this is the new terminal. It's essentially a replacement for the traditional command line. But what it does is it centralizes the different CLIs that you might have on your machine. So if I show you this, what I've got available, so I've got a PowerShell, I've got the old traditional command prompts, I've got Ubuntu, which comes to you when you've installed WSL, and if that's the distribution that you choose to use. I've got the Bash and Azure Cloud Shell. I'll just go over the settings. I'll just touch on this just quickly. Just find that. So this is the settings file that you use. It allows nice, easy setup of your different profiles, and you can set key bindings. It's very cool, and the features and the versions of it are dropping very regularly. So if it's not something that you've come across yet, I definitely recommend going and check it out. Especially if you use the terminal, it's very cool. So if I run Ubuntu, so this is essentially the WSL version running now, and as you can see, it's mounting my C drive, and I can now execute Linux commands directly from this console. It is possible to split this, and now I can't remember how you do it. But it is possible to have it is possible to have split screen, so you can have the command prompt, you can have the your Linux. I can't remember how you do it now, but it's definitely possible, which is also really cool. If you want Git Bash open but you want your terminal, you can have them split screen within the same window. You can open other different instances. You could have your Ubuntu instance open, and you could have that in 3 split screens. It all works it out for you. You can move them around. So, but yeah, it's essentially running WSL is as simple as clicking on the distribution that you've got on your list. As you add a new distribution, it appears in this list automatically. So it's really cool. If I want to run WSL from the command line, just if I want to run it from here, and this will start my default distribution that's been configured. And again, it just runs straight from your command terminal. So exit that, takes me back. So like I say, that's just a quick overview. It's something that's quite cool, and like I say, it is kind of related, but not quite. Right, past. So I'm going to go through now. Have a very brief look, because it's not been around that long. It's hard to cover too much that's related to the past around this topic, but I'd put it in the title of the talk before I'd actually finished the talk. So I've left it in there just so that I cover it off for anyone that's interested. So it originated, or it started around the time where Microsoft was working on a project called Project Astoria, and this was a Microsoft's foray into trying to allow Android applications to run on a Windows mobile device, which have all now completely failed, as far as I know. It was first introduced, WSL1, that project started a long time before, but WSL1 come along in August 2016. So it's not something that Microsoft has only just started to try and attack. It's something that Microsoft have been trying to achieve for quite a while, to allow this cross-platform, these cross-platform calls. When it was first released to the world in August 2016, there was only the possibility of using the Ubuntu image. and further distributions come along later in 2017. So this is related to WSL2. So a lot of people might have seen this. If people who were interested in WSL2 when it first come out, you had to be on Windows 10 version 2004, which was April 2020. I've done some looking into this, and according to Rad Duplex, who run reports on different versions of Windows and stuff, and the quantity of users that are using them, in July 2020, which is 3 months, sorry, after this WSL2 was originally released on this version of Windows 10, it only had a share of Windows 10 users of 11.6%. So Microsoft ended up deciding that they needed to extend this, which we'll touch on in a minute. So the present, so I'll go over some stuff, but this is where I will do a few demos, and we'll cover a few different things off in the demos. So as of August 2020, WSL2 was backported to older versions of Windows. And this now means that anyone that's on the March 2019 or September 2019 version of Windows 10 is now supported in terms of WSL2. And that, according to that duplex again, as of December, that now covers off 94.6% of Windows 10 users, which is a lot better than the 11.6 that were covered previously, because they want it to be available for as many as possible. So one of the weaknesses that WSL2 has is the installation process, or it is, in my opinion. It's a lot more complex than it seems to need to be. So you have to use the deployment image servicing and management tool. If you want to use the command line, it is possible to enable these features using the install Windows features. But you have to install you have to enable the feature virtual machine platform and the subsystem Microsoft Windows subsystem for Linux features. Then you have to restart your machine. Then you can set the default version to 2, because you can run versions 1 and 2 side by side. So if you want to run all your new distributions as version 2, then you need to run that command, and then you need to switch over then to the Microsoft Store to install the Linux distribution that you want. It is possible to install manually, so CentOS aren't present on the Microsoft Store, but you can install CentOS by downloading the distribution from their website. So I'm sure that there's probably other distros that are similar. So there are a range of these that are available in the Microsoft Store. I think there's about 10 different ones. You can import and export your distros from TAR files, which is very useful if you want to get the Ubuntu image, say, and then install .NET Core or install any Python or whatever other tooling that you want in there. You can then export that version that you have created, and that can then be shared around with different members of your team, or you can use it as a backup so that it's easy. Or if you're moving machine, you can just export it and just take it with you. Like I say, it just gets stored as a TAR file. So as I've also mentioned, CentOS have got a version for WSL that isn't in the Microsoft Store for some reason. I don't know what that is. I don't know. And you also have the ability to sideload Linux distributions, but that seems that I've done some digging online. It's a little bit like a rabbit hole. It's not something that I think is applicable for this tour, because I think it's a bit in depth for just the scenario of just being able to debug your applications. So I will just show in the store. So that I loaded this up earlier, just run a search for Linux, so you can see there's a couple of different versions of Ubuntu. There's Kali Linux. There's one of the SUSE images, Debian. There's RAF WSL. And I believe that there are one or two others that just haven't made this list. But there's a lot of other tooling that's appearing in this version, so in this search. Right, so I'm just going to do a demo now of the import export process, just so that everyone's aware of that. So one problem that I've got is that my machine, when I tried this earlier, struggled with it performed the export, but it did take 5 minutes, and I don't think everyone wants to sit 5 minutes waiting for this to perform that. So I have got one Ubuntu image that I have installed .NET in. It's 4 gig, so I think that's why the export took 5 minutes. But we can do an import of this. So if we go WSL list all, as you can see from this, I've got a Ubuntu image distribution that's installed. That's my default, and then I've got 2 Docker desktop distributions that are set up whenever you install Docker desktop, as that now can take advantage of WSL2 as well. So so I'll start this, and then I'll probably just carry on talking. What's that not working? Yes. Yeah. So I'll come back to that one. We'll just let that run, just so that you can see that the export command and the import command are quite simple. So actually, sorry. So if I was to run the export, the command is just, it's very similar to this one, but it's just WSL. And then rather than import, you would use export. And then it is the image that you'd want to export. So that would be the distro to export. So that would be Ubuntu. And then it's the address of the tar file after that. So that would be, in this instance, it'd be this here, if you wanted it in that directory. If I wanted to remove one of these, so if I want to get rid of the Ubuntu image, then it's possible to just run an unregister command, specified, which is just WSL unregister, and then you can pass in the name of the distribution, and that'll unlink that then from your list of distributions that it's available to use. The one thing to be aware of when you're doing that is that caught me out earlier was that if you do that, then it just randomly selects another distribution to be your default. So you don't know which version. Then if you were to come along and open a new window and just to run WSL, you wouldn't be sure as to which version that you are going to end up with. So it is better to change your default distribution first and then come back and remove the one that you no longer want. So the command to set the default distribution is WSL -- set default, and then the name of whatever instance it is that you want to have set up. So don't know if this is going to finish. We don't need that later on anyway, so I'll leave that running for now. Right. Oh no, now my machine's froze. No, we're okay. We've just skipped ahead quite a few slides. Apologies for this. Right. So once WSL is installed, we have the it is stored in your local app data. So this is a example of what the image looks like, and when you spin up WSL, this is then extended into this file is opened up into the file system that you would see in Linux. So if I was to start the terminal, I think that import command's grounding everything to a halt. And I was to start WSL. This WSL command is normally instant. It's definitely just because this command's running. I think I'm going to cancel that, guys. Yeah, there we go. As soon as I've cancelled that, it's stopped running. So once I've started WSL, as you can see in Linux, it mounts the directory structure within the Linux file system. So if I go to mount, you will then be able to see that I've got multiple drives on my Windows machine that are all available for use from within Linux. So I could then go to a file that's on my C drive and use Vim to edit it or whatever. And that's exactly like one of the use cases for WSL. What I also have the ability to do is from here, from the Windows Explorer, you then see all of the distributions that you've got that you've started. If I enter around WSL in here, I wouldn't see the Ubuntu version, the Ubuntu share. But if I click in here, I can then see the structure. I can go to home or somewhere that's actually got something in. Or I can see the files. I can edit them with Notepad++ then if that's what I want to do. So it's very useful stuff. It allows the switching back and forward to be very seamless. Yes, I think that's enough for the file system. So now I've got a couple of demos in Visual Studio 2019 and then VS Code to go over how you can do development and how you can debug and step through and see the differences in how the apps behave. I'll start with the Visual Studio one, I think. So Visual Studio by default doesn't support WSL2 running. It's coming in. It's in version 16.9 preview 1, but that's still the preview version. So and then even then, I think it's optional. It'll be an optional feature. I'm not sure if it'll be an optional feature that's turned on or off by default. I don't know if they've announced that yet. So this is a very, very simple example. It isn't really about the code. It's more about what how seamless, I guess, the demonstration is to show you that you can develop something in Windows, for Windows, or for Linux, and you can test it on both pretty seamlessly, to be honest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this code now, which is just a little console application that essentially just writes to the console what operating system that it's currently running under. So hopefully, fingers crossed, this will work. So this is currently running on my Windows. I'm running a Windows machine, and as you can see, it's run on Windows. And then what you have to do with Visual Studio to get this to work currently is there is a extension that's available that's published by Microsoft, and it's just a case of installing that, and you should be good to go. So once you've got that installed, you then get an option in this list for WSL2. So this again will run using your default distribution that you've got configured in your system. I believe that it is possible to set up in your properties. So in here you can specify multiple distributions, and you can have them that they will then appear as WSL2 co1 and the name of the instance. So if you want to test it for Alpine and you want to test it for Ubuntu, you have the two different distributions available within this list of profiles. So if I then run this as using the WSL2, as I said, because it's not got a distribution specified, it'll use my default one, and now you can see it's using the Unix kernel there. So and that's essentially as difficult as it is. This applies. Even though this example is really simple, the concept applies whether it's a web application, whether it's a console application. That the premise holds. So what it also allows you to do is you can debug. So even though this is running against the Linux kernel, you can still debug and step through your code exactly the same as you would maybe want to during your development. If everyone has to debug at some time, I suppose, even the best of us. So that's Visual Studio. I'll now do a small demonstration of the same thing, but in Visual Studio Code for anyone that prefers this as their ID. There are small differences in how well that this is integrated between. So I've only used Visual Studio for this setting up this demo, but Visual Studio, because that support's come a lot later, Visual Studio Code has had this support for quite a while, and actually I think that the Visual Studio 2019 integration is easier to use and more seamless than it is to use the Visual Studio Code interface, to be honest. So So yeah, so if I want to run this in here, it's the command. There we go. So we get that printed out. Like I say, this is running on my Windows machine. If I then want to use the WSL, you get this square rectangle down the bottom corner, and then you get a list of options. So you can either open a completely new window, you can open a new window using a distribution of your choice. So the distribution list appears in this drop down. You can open a specific folder, or you can reopen this folder, which I think would normally be the option. I don't know why that one isn't at the top, to be honest. It's the only one that I ever used. So, and what this essentially does is it opens it so that I can then run this using the Ubuntu distribution. So if we do the same thing again, you can see that this is running the code from the mount that I've got on my Windows machine here. So don't run. You'll notice here that because these are hosted on my Windows machine, that this is where the slowness comes. Ideally, this code I would port to Linux, and I don't believe that the Windows would have as much of a problem running this as it does the Linux does the other way. So, and you can see the same result as what we got in Visual Studio before this. So, just something that I've just noticed that I've missed. So I touched on before that the Linux kernel used by WSL2 was open source and maintained by Microsoft. If anyone is interested, the code is available on GitHub. Yeah, I delved too much into it, but I just thought someone might be interested in that, so thought I'd share it with you. So I've now got a very, I guess it's quite similar. Just shut that down so that try and free up some resource on this machine. So I know a lot of people now use Docker containers, and this is one of their big things that Microsoft are happy that they've got this set up and running now at WSL2, and that the uptake and the developer reaction to it has been quite positive from what I've seen. So, but it now gives a lot better performance than what previously Windows and Docker just didn't really work. No one really used them as a pair. If you got a Linux container, it was run on Linux. It wasn't really run on Windows, and the reason for that is that Docker on Windows was using the Hyper-V for its emulation, whereas Docker now supports WSL2, which means that it gets to run its calls directly on the Linux kernel. So it gives much better performance than what it did before. So I've just got a small web app just to prove that this works with web apps. I've not got this example in Visual Studio 2019 because the containerization functionality built into Visual Studio 2019 I had problems with, and I was getting some very dodgy, inconsistent results, and I was worried that the demos wouldn't go smoothly as it is. We've all been there with demos that don't quite work right, I'm sure. So I decided to leave that one off, but I believe it is possible, or it will be possible at some point, but I've got Visual Studio a lot more consistent in its results, so I'll stick with that one for now. So like I say, I've got this ASP.NET Core application. If I build the image from this Docker file that I've got, let that run. I did run this earlier, so it should have everything in the cache. So that's built. So if I come down into the Docker, I can see that I've got this latest image. That's not right. 30. That's not right. 30 minutes ago. This is what I meant about the demos getting wrong. So what that should have done is refresh this. Luckily, I'd ran this earlier, so we'll try and run this now. So if I run that, oh no. Right, that's not working, I'm afraid. Right. Anyway, that's not working, but all that this would have done is this would have shown just ran a web application, and the Docker, because I've informed Docker to use Linux containers, you can switch it to Windows containers, but because it was running on Linux containers, it automatically just runs using the Linux kernel, and it behaves as if that container was hosted on Linux, essentially. So I do apologize that isn't working, but it's because I think it was because I was switching between Windows and Linux previously to see whether it was worth doing a demo for both, and I think that's what's caused this issue. So I'll move on. Just bring the slides back up. Yeah. So weaknesses of WSL2. I don't want to just harp on and as if that it's all good and that there's no downsides to it. As I've touched on already, I think that the installation process is more complex than it needs to be. There isn't the full coverage of every Linux distribution available. There is quite a small covering of them, to be honest. But I think that it probably, in terms of what businesses are using, it probably covers off the majority of them. So I think that's probably why it is such a limited amount. And the other downside is that if you want to run a .NET Core application, then you need to have, if you are building it on, because you're debugging in WSL, you need to have the SDK installed on all the distributions that you've got. So you will need it on your machine if that's where you're developing. If you want to build it, you will need it on your Ubuntu distribution, but you will also need it then on the Debian distribution. Each one has to be maintained individually because they are essentially just a virtual machine. So, but even though you've got, I think it feels worse because you've got access across the file systems, but you still have to install these features across the different distributions. It becomes just a bit more of a maintenance task, but I guess for the amount of time that you save, it's not the end of the world. But It would be nice if there was something there that you could install these dependencies in one place and they were shared across the different distributions and your working machine. So right, so a lot of the features that I'll talk about coming up will be released in the 21H1 Windows 10 release, but there are one or two that are still just in the pipeline and are only on the inside rings. So I don't think that they'll quite come yet. But a lot of the release dates for some of this stuff is quite woolly. So I haven't gone into any specifics. If there's any features that you're really interested in that I cover, then I can either find out for you, or I'm sure you can find yourself. So as I've said, it is a weakness, and Microsoft has spotted that. So they have simplified the installation process. Coming in the future, it's a lot simpler now. So you've got your WSL install, which is the initial setup of WSL. So that essentially does the two DISM calls that it did before. You'll still need a restart, but it'll also set WSL2 as your default version. So you've kind of replaced 3 calls with 1. But like I say, you'll still need your restart. That'll have to be run as an administrator because it makes them changes to your Windows features. You've then got the WSL list online, which is a really useful feature. So while I tried to show you the distributions that were available in the Microsoft Store, this can be run from a command prompt, and you can then see all the versions that are available in the Microsoft Store, because it's not that simple to just go and track down and see them in one place in that store. So that'll be quite a useful feature. You will also have the ability to install the distribution from the command line, so you don't have to go into the Microsoft Store. And then the last command that I've listed here, the update, is to update the kernel. So if there are any new updates to the Microsoft's Linux kernel, then this will download and apply them updates to your machine without having to wait for a new version of a new either security patch or whatever it comes as currently. So just gives you a bit more freedom to update at will. So there is also GPU support coming. So it's been the #1 requested feature since WSL was first released. It's took them a while for come up with this, but it now gives the ability to use this when you're testing any machine learning models or AI models inside WSL. You can now take full advantage of the GPU as well as the CPU, which you had before. This has been supported now by Docker for a while because it's been in the pipeline. So their support for this should be fairly good as well. If you've got any of these models that are containerized, straight away, as soon as it's released, you'll be able to take advantage of this support. So the X4 mounts you'll now be able to use once this feature's released. So anyone that's dual boots, or you'll be able, if you've got a Linux and a Windows partition, you'll be able to mount them drives. No, actually, not partition. If you've got 2 drives and you boot, then you can use this mount from your Windows boot. You can then access the files on your Linux drive that you would access normally via your dual boot. So that could have some very useful use cases, I believe. Yeah, there are some questions around that. So partitions, if you've got two separate partitions, I don't think that you'll be able to mount them at the minute. I think that support will probably come, but at the minute this is just for physical drives that you can mount. So another feature that's in the pipeline is the ability to run commands when a distribution's first spun up. So I've got wrote this the other day, which is a very small command just to state that this distribution was started. You could forward that to a file if you wanted to keep a log of these when these distributions were started. But what this essentially will do is if you come up here in terminal and you start a new Ubuntu instance, then it'll output that to the screen. Or like I say, you could forward that on to a file as well. So, and one of the biggest features, I'm surprised that this wasn't the number one feature that people were requesting, is GUI support. So this will allow users to run Windows and Linux applications side by side. This is very fuzzy around the details around this because it's still fairly early days. I think it's probably not in Microsoft, but for developers that are working on it, but it's early days in terms of the announcements that they've made for it. So there isn't too many details that are available at the minute on this. But my prediction from digging around for this is that it'll be late 21, early 22. So, but we'll just have to see. It could be any time. So, for anyone that's interested, obviously people have attended this talk on WSL. I've just included a few Twitter accounts. So Craig here is the program manager at Microsoft who works on WSL. So any new features that come, he's normally straight there on Twitter, sharing them with the world. Stuart Leeks, who's the software engineer at Microsoft, he's just written a really good book that's published by Pact about WSL2. So if anyone is interested, that's really good. I'd recommend going and take a look at that. And then Kayla Cinnamon, she is also a program manager at Microsoft, and she works more specifically with the terminal. So if anyone's interested in finding out more about the terminal or any of the latest releases, she's a great one to follow as well. So blog posts. So I haven't actually got anything about WSL. I've got some blogs in the pipeline that will be around WSL and around the things that I've pulled together for this talk. So maybe don't take a look there straight away, but in the future there'll be posts there. And Stuart Leeks has got quite a lot of content around WSL, so he's a very good resource for if you want to dig any deeper or find out any more tips or tricks around WSL. And finally, you've got the Microsoft docs. They're quite in depth and quite detailed, so they're a good place for start with if you want to find out more. And that's it from me. So the only other thing that I'd say is that if anyone's got any questions that they don't want to raise to the group and want to get in touch, then my details are here.